If you're thinking of undertaking an overland adventure, in this series of videos I'd like to share with you how I plan and prepare for one of our own vehicle expeditions. Hi, I'm Mac from Mac's Adventure. We're expedition specialists with 25 years experience of operating vehicles in the most extreme environments on Earth. So for most people planning their own vehicle expedition, they think that the important bit is the vehicle itself, the modifications you can do to it, the accessories that you can bolt onto it, but that's not actually the case. As the Mongol Rally guys have clearly shown us, almost any vehicle can take you around the world, even something as small as a Nissan Micra. There are much more important things to deal with that will ensure that your trip is successful, including picking the right team members, sharing the same goals, and ensuring that you've planned a realistic schedule. If you're sitting next to somebody who's driving you absolutely insane before you even get to the first border crossing, you're not going to care what vehicle you're in. You're not going to care what tyres, what suspension, or if it's got a snorkel. It's just going to ruin the trip. So what I'm going to do, in no particular order over the coming weeks, is share some of the important things that I think will help you put your own trip together. So we're going to look at team selections and training, paperwork and documents, vehicle choice and preparation, tools and spares, extrication and first aid, clothing and equipment, shelter and sleeping, food and water, navigation and tracking, communications, driving and convoy drills, recovery and equipment, border crossings and money, safety, security and survival, health and medical. But first of all, we're going to deal with expedition planning. So when you're at the initial planning stage of your trip, sitting at a desk like I am, working it all out on your computer, there are two things that you must always have running through the back of your mind as you're making decisions about how you're putting this whole trip together. The first, the likely scenarios. The second, the survival rule of 3. So likely scenarios, you must always be considering what is the worst case scenario I'm going to find myself in. It could be something like, what's the coldest temperature ever recorded in a particular part of the world I'm travelling through? Do I have the right clothing to survive in those temperatures? Now with the survival rule of 3, it's basically your life expectancy. 3 minutes, 3 hours, 3 days and 3 weeks. The first thing, accident. If you have an accident in a remote area and you haven't got the right help and you've got something like a catastrophic bleed, your life expectancy could be as short as 3 minutes. The next is shelter. And we're mainly talking cold here. But we're not talking that cold, and we don't have to be in that extreme part of the world. If you're up in Scotland, even in the summer, it could be snowing on top of a mountain, horrendous wind chill. If you do not have the right shelter for your body, it could all be over in 3 hours. And I'm not talking about a tent shelter, a sleeping bag shelter, a vehicle shelter. I'm talking about the clothing to protect your naked body. If you do not have the right layers to protect you from that environment, it could all be over within 3 hours. The next 3 days is water. The average person can survive for 3 days without water. And then finally, food. The average person can survive for 3 weeks without food. So as you're making all of your decisions, as you're planning your trip, you've got to decide the priorities, what's important, and how you're going to lay it out. So when it comes to the countries you plan to travel through, there are 2 things you need to consider. The terrain that you're going to be traveling over and the climate that you're going to be traveling through. Now with terrain, are you dealing with snow, ice, mud, gravel tracks, sand, tarmac? Who knows? It's just going to take some research on the internet to try and figure out what you're going to be up against and what your vehicle is going to be up against. Working out climate though is a bit easier, and I'll leave website links in the description box below for where I go in order to find out what are the temperatures going to be like. Am I travelling during the rainy season or the dry season? That will then determine what clothing I wear, what equipment I carry. And the other good one is the amount of daylight you're expecting. If you're heading up into the high Arctic and you want to see the northern lights, you don't want to go up there in July, 24 hours of daylight. Now, for most people heading off on their own overland adventure, they will be limited to the amount of time they can take to complete the trip. Be that because they've got to get back to work, or they just don't have the funds to keep going indefinitely. Now, there are 2 or 3 things that can actually slow you down quite dramatically. The cold and the heat do cause you to travel a lot slower than you normally would. Altitude is another one that people probably don't know too much about, but there are very strict guidelines in order to do with your rate of ascent and your acclimatization. The other thing that slows you down quite a lot, border crossings. Now, from experience, I've always allowed a minimum of half a day to enter and half a day to exit a particular country. So this can really slow you down if you've got multiple countries you're trying to cross, particularly if you're trying to do them quickly. So when it comes to figuring out the distance you plan to travel each day, I work on an average of 200 miles per day is about as good as it's going to get, which you may think is a considerably small amount, in that on a normal road you could achieve that in 4 hours, but some parts of the world you might be down to 100, 125 miles per day, and they would be long days to try and achieve that. Now this is where Google Maps is very useful. Rather than simply putting an A to B and saying I'm going to travel 200 miles every day, work out that you want to travel, say, 6 hours a day, and then use the little cursor to figure out where 6 hours of driving will take you, and then use those as your overnight stops. Because 6 hours driving in some parts of the world could be 300 miles, in other parts of the world it could be 75 miles. And so that's a very useful tool off Google Maps. There are very few parts of the world that it won't cover. Now you must also consider the safety of the countries that you plan to travel through. Now for us here in the UK, I use the FCO website, that's the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. The thing is though, they always do err on the side of caution. There might have been an incident 6 months ago, but the area is still red flagged. So try and get in touch with tour companies over there. Try and use vehicle enthusiast groups, other travellers, forums, to try and maybe get a little bit more realistic picture of what's happening on the ground. So when you've picked your team, the next thing you need to all agree on is the style of trip that you're going to undertake. Is it going to be relaxing? Is it going to be challenging? Is it going to be adventurous? Is it going to be cultural? Are you there to see the wildlife? Whatever it is, you've all got to agree on it. If you've got wildly differing views as to the purpose of the overland trip you're going to undertake, probably better that you part company early. So having picked the right team, ensure that you've all signed up to the same page. The next thing is to figure out whether you have any experience amongst you. If you don't have any prior experience, it's a really good idea to do a bit of a shakedown run in the UK or your home country. Now, even if you do have experience of many trips, there are still certain things that you should really brush up on before heading off on a big overland trip. First aid, very important. Operating in remote environments. Mechanics, communications, vehicle recovery, even off-road driving. So get yourself on a proper first aid course. And same again, I'll leave description in the box below with details of who we use when it comes to our first aid refreshers. Now the other thing you've got to consider, of which there are many, is do you travel alone? Do you travel with a group of vehicles? Now, there are obviously advantages, and mainly on the safety side when it comes to travelling with more than one, and 3 is probably the optimum number of vehicles. Any more than that and it just starts to slow things down. However, with 3 vehicles, it does allow you to be a little bit more adventurous, in that if you came to a certain section along your route and as a lone vehicle you'd think, if I don't get through this, I am absolutely stuffed. There's no way I'm getting out of it. With multiple vehicles there to help you, be it to winch off, recovery, more people to push and dig, you can certainly be more adventurous in your undertaking. And when it comes to vehicle choice, if you are all driving the same type of vehicle with the same engine and the same gearbox and the same tyres, then you've only really got to carry one set of spares. So as well as duration, climate, terrain, vehicle and experience, there is another factor that will limit the amount of time that you can either spend away on your trip or where you can head for, and that's cost. Now everyone's bank balance is different, but there are certain things that will either restrict how long you can spend away or where in the world you can head for. One of them, for those of you who haven't heard of, is the Carnet de Passage, and I have a copy here. Now for those of you who don't know about this, it's basically a passport for the vehicle. It's to stop you illegally importing your vehicle, making a huge buck and jumping on the first plane out of there. A lot of countries, particularly in Western and Southern Africa, do require a carnet, and they can be prohibitively expensive. And it's all based on the value of the vehicle. So the more expensive the car you own, the more expensive your carnet becomes. It's not a fixed cost. Now, one country that doesn't require a carnet is China, but they require a customs deposit based on the value of the vehicle itself, and you only get that back 1 month after you've left the country. The other big expense are visas. Now, for example, our London to Cape Town run, each person's visas were £800. So visas, carnet are very expensive, and shipping. To do an out and return, if you've only got 2 or 3 weeks off, you're spending an awful lot of time just retracing steps, heading back home again. Whereas if you were doing an A to B and travelling further out, shipping and flying home, you could get a lot further in the world. But shipping is also expensive. Accommodation and food also can be expensive. Now, we tend to try and immerse ourselves more into the culture of a country, and therefore we try and both eat with the locals and stay in cheap hostels and lodges and hotels. For us, I will budget around £30 per person per day for food and around about £40 per person per day for accommodation. Fuel is another one. Now, it varies dramatically. Turkey is very expensive. Saudi Arabia is ridiculously cheap. Another good website to figure out how much the whole trip is going to cost you, I'll leave the link to that, which gives global fuel prices. Just bear in mind, you're going to be traveling with heavy vehicles, you're going to be traveling on rough terrain, therefore you're going to be in a lower gear, and the fuel quality is going to be poorer. So when it comes to listing out everything that I have to do in order to put an expedition together, I use an Excel spreadsheet. So I would highly recommend you get pretty familiar with using one. Everything I have to do for the trip, everything I have to buy, everything I have to source is listed on the Excel spreadsheet. And I'll divide it up into 3 sections. There's the pre-expedition side of things, everything you have to do before you physically get going. The expedition itself, what you have to do or pay for while you're on the expedition. And then post-expedition is getting yourselves and your vehicle back home. So it's split into 3 sections and everything is color coordinated. So we have, if a company has been contacted for sponsorship or I'm looking to buy something, then they will be highlighted in yellow. If a task or a sponsorship approach is in progress, then it will be orange. If it's ready to go, i.e. I physically have it in my hands or the job has been physically completed 100%, then it's marked green. And certainly when it comes to sponsorship things, if they're not interested or the task cannot be performed, then it is marked as a red. But just very, very quickly going through here to give you an idea about what I'm dealing with. On the pre-expedition side, we've listed the team training. Where are we going to store all the equipment that we're going to take on the trip? The PR, media approaches, online, stuff like that. Dealing with any media, the finances, the money side of things. Fundraising, if it's a charitable endeavour. Security, so things like contacting the Foreign Office. Doing some risk assessments, figuring out is it safe what you're going to undertake. Having an emergency plan. The medical, ensuring that the team are fit to undertake the trip and you've got all the right vaccinations. Vehicle documents, we'll deal with that in another video. Personal documents, passports, visas, that kind of thing. All of the clothing listed. all the personal equipment listed. The team equipment, so that would be things like tents, spare clothing, water filtration, cooking equipment, etc. Communication equipment, i.e. between vehicles or from vehicles back to the UK. With the also got tracking, navigation, we take guidebooks, filming equipment for the film crew, photography equipment, medical equipment for the doctor, a whole list of stuff there. Then we get down to what vehicles are we using, what modifications are we going to undertake, what equipment are they going to carry, tools and spares. So it goes down. And if it's a charitable thing, patrons and ambassadors. Then on the expedition itself, we have not only the expedition team, but the most important person of the whole team setup is your UK operations manager. It's incredibly important, particularly if you're heading somewhere that is a little bit more challenging, a bit more remote, potentially dangerous, that you've got this eye in the sky keeping a watch on your every move. You can't see while you're on the road is what's 100 miles ahead of you. Has there been a natural disaster? Has there been some political upheaval? This person you have to have 100% confidence in that they will help you and deal with the situation 24/7 until it's resolved. We also use guides. We'll also arrange sort of start and finish media events if it's a biggish thing. You've then got to consider your food, your accommodation, your fuel, border crossing. There are other charges. Things like environmental tax, road tax, tolls, that kind of thing. You may have to service your vehicle en route. Oil changes. We tend to do it every 5,000 kilometres, 3,000 miles. There's a cost attached to that. Security. If you're parked up in a city and you want to spend the night in a hotel or a hostel or somewhere, you probably have to pay for someone to keep an eye on your vehicle, particularly if it's got a lot of stuff hanging off the outside of it. Taxis you might need to get to airports or help scurry you around buying stuff. It's a lot quicker than taking your own vehicle. Communications using internet cafes. And then post-expedition it tends to be shipping the vehicles home and flying yourselves home. So for most of you watching this video, an overland adventure is a time for relaxation, for leisure, to get away from the stresses and strains of normal work and everyday life. However, they can put stress on you, both physically and mentally. So make sure you're fit before you head off. Make sure you don't have any ailments that you're dealing with. And just make sure mentally you are in the right frame of mind to undertake such an adventure, but also that your team members are. Always ensure that your team are multi-skilled. If you have someone who is a medic, make sure they have another skill, because they might find that they're not doing anything on the trip. They'll get bored, you'll get a bit frustrated because there are other things that need doing. So if you're being sponsored for your overland adventure, it's incredibly important that you come home with more in the way of photos and film footage than your sponsor was expecting. Hence, taking a good photographer with you. Not only is it incredibly embarrassing having to go to them with the lack of marketing material for them, there's also the chance that they're unlikely to ever want to support you again. Having a good social media presence also helps, as well as having contacted conventional media in the way of local newspapers, magazines or radio stations to cover your story will all help. So the final thing to mention in this first video about expedition planning is always expect the unexpected. There will be things that you just cannot plan for and you cannot research, and you're just going to have to deal with it as best you can on the ground. I hope this first video has been of use. If it has, please don't forget to subscribe and share, and look out for our next video. Hope to see you next time, and until then, take care. Thanks for watching.